Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Apollo Art Analysis. This episode, we're going to be taking a look at a piece generated by OpenAI's DALL-E II. This episode, we're going to talk a little bit about this hazy aesthetic. We're going to talk about the origins of the fairy, and we're also going to talk about the profound power of OpenAI's DALL-E II. So let's jump right into it. So when I first see this piece, you're met with the scene of a kind of lone fairy here kind of running across the scene. Of course, there is a lot of motion blur in here that does give that sense of motion within the work at hand. And it's also in the format of a photo, so it gives this really surreal scene a much more convincing quality, of course, in the format of that photograph for sure. And so we see our subject here primarily defined through this kind of light on dark contrast that really works to accent and elevate the visual impact of our subject's form here. Definitely catches the eye, and it definitely, if you were, say, kind of a passing glance looking at this piece, you would really definitely see that for sure. That light on dark contrast is just unmistakable. Definitely catches the eye and elevates the visual impact of the subject there for sure. And so we see a really hazy aesthetic here. Of course, I talked a little bit about that motion blur, and that can probably be primarily attributed to that as well. So this piece was also created with OpenAI's DALL-E II. So this was kind of a text prompt. So with that in mind, let's look at how this was created. So, quote, a real-life fairy accidentally caught on camera in the 1980s. Imagine there's a Y there. A real life fairy accidentally caught on camera in the 1980s. So we can't attribute that kind of hazy aesthetic most likely to the 1980s, but also the fact that the fairy is kind of running out of sight, accidentally caught on camera, trying to escape our view for sure. So kind of that 1980s time period combining with the fact that she's running away, we do see that hazy aesthetic. And with that in mind, it does feel like we're kind of in a surreal dream here. It's kind of hazy, kind of flows back and forth through that for sure. So we definitely see the influences there, say from that 1980s aesthetic or kind of that dreamlike aesthetic that we're looking at here for sure. And so with that in mind, fairies are by definition, metaphysical creatures, and they're kind of stuck between the realm of mortal and immortal. And so, say, some of the most earliest origins, they were seen as kind of sinful creatures. They were actually cursed between the realm of mortal and immortal, kind of like stuck in a purgatory, almost like a half state. And that's quite interesting, I think, as well. We're also going to talk about how, say, we're looking at a much more modern depiction of a fairy, but fairies a long, long time ago were such a broad category, and they were also seen as much more kind of trickery. They were seen as a little bit more how would you say, mischievous or kind of malevolent. And we'll go a bit deeper on that in a second, but I just wanted to show you guys, you definitely see that metaphysical influences. You see kind of the wings. The wings, of course, is the realm of the sky, the realm of the divine, so we definitely see some influences there as well. And so, like I said, we're looking at a fairy here. So fairies, the original classification for a fairy in kind of European folktale was extremely broad. We're talking everything from imps and trolls to what we'd see as all the way to dragons. So fairy tales really kind of encompass all of these different creatures. But what we're looking at is a very modern and definitely very kind of fluffed up and kind of whitewashed version of the fairy for sure. And kind of whitewashed in the sense that it's, super benevolent, super good, and doesn't have any trickery, doesn't have any mischief that we would traditionally associate, say, with a much more historic depiction of fairies for sure. And so with that in mind, we see the fairies have many different faces. And what I mean by that is you have some that are dark and some that are divine. And so the divine ones are going to be the much more helping, much more kindred spirits, trying to kind of assist the human in any way possible. If there's any kind of mistake or any type of, conflict, the benevolent fairy or the much more good fairy is always trying to rectify that. So I definitely see that much. The kind of good or benevolent fairy is much more associated with, say, the feminine form, kind of dainty. That's normally how they depict it traditionally. So we do see that here, a much more kind of whitewashed, much more benevolent version, what we kind of associate with, say, the Disney series for sure. And then we also have the dark deviations of the fairies as well. We don't see that within the piece at hand, but I did want to mention it. And those are going to be the ones that will really say anything to trick you one way or another. They're very mischievous. They're trying to, kind of get one back at you, and they actually hoard wealth in any way possible. So with that in mind, you can definitely see how, say, greed and lies kind of mix with that to create a very kind of deadly and kind of terrifying combo with their trickery for sure. And so, with that mischief comes a lot of people kind of wanted protection from these spirits. Of course, they've kind of abstract this idea. And I would say one of the most influential ones we see is going to be the deviations from Norse mythology. Fairies are kind of what we associate really today with a lot of different qualities of fairies for sure. And so, with that in mind, like we said, a bit of mischief that's normally associated with the fairies. And there were a lot of people, especially kind of Christians, who wanted to have a charm from these fairies or these trickery spirits. You can definitely see them as almost kind of demonic-esque figures, kind of fallen angels or half angels. And that's what a lot of people saw them at for sure. So, with this piece, like we said, we see a much more benevolent, much more light or good depiction of that for sure. And fairies actually saw a resurgence during the Romantic period as well. And the Romantic period, of course, was seen primarily as a call towards the past. Of course, you had the industrial influences. And since the Romantic period and beyond, fairies have just exploded in popularity. Of course, Disney, a few, of course, decades later, did incredible influences to just continue building on that today. Maybe to the point where we see fairies as all good and, magic and spirits. And that is true, but there is a kind of trickery or dark element to that for sure. And so with that in mind, definitely a really cool piece. Of course, an AI generative art piece. And what's so strange is it can create such surreal scenes in incredibly high resolution. So we certainly see that for sure. You see how OpenAI's DALL-E II is incredibly powerful. Of course, a real-life fairy accidentally caught on camera in the 1980s. We see that for sure. Definitely influences, and it kind of immerses us straight amidst this surreal scene. It's just incredible to look at. So I hope you guys enjoyed this piece. Hope you guys learned something. We talked a little bit about, fays and fairies, talked about the influences, the origins of those, talked about kind of the metaphysical as also this hazy aesthetic, and of course OpenAI's DALL-E II and the profound power of AI as a whole. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys learned something. My name is Apollo. This was Apollo Art Analysis, and I'll see you guys on the next episode.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to support our work directly, please check out our Apollo community tokens. Apollo Art Exchange is an ecosystem of art appreciation which elevates artists each and every day. Thanks for listening.